This video is for junior high history. We're looking at the highlights from pages 221 to 226. So we left off with yesterday's video on page 221 at the United States enters the war. So remember that President Woodrow Wilson had kept America neutral for the first 3 years of the war. Even when the Lusitania sank and 100 Americans died on it, the United States still remained neutral. So let's see exactly what brought America into the war. In March of 1917, British agents discovered, highlight this, a German telegram actually, asking the country of Mexico to enter the war on the German side. Keep highlighting, this letter was called the Zimmerman Note, and it promised Mexico land from the states of New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona in return for help with the war. Now remember, these are all lands that the United States had either gained in the Mexican War or purchased from Mexico after that. So Germany was telling Mexico, if you fight with us against America, we'll give you back those lands that you lost in that war with America. So, promising off pieces of American land, Germany very much overreached herself here. It was very cocky, very prideful to say in advance, we're going to divide up the United States. And they lived to very much regret that. Find down towards the bottom of that column, the German ruler would stop at nothing. Highlight that, the German ruler would stop at nothing. Keep highlighting. If he won in Europe, he would go after America. Our country at this point was being threatened. So that is what truly brought America into the war. They read this Zimmerman Note that was given to them by the British agents, and they realized, this threat isn't just to Europe anymore. If Germany conquers all of Europe, they're coming after us. And that started to scare people, and that pushed the government into action to declare war. So turn the page, find the bold words, the world must be made safe for democracy. Highlight those. That was a very famous statement that President Wilson made in his war message. And this was the determination that was made. The world was going to be made safe for democracy. So the Americans joined the war, and now the Germans had to fight a brand new, fresh army. So look down at the end of the Great War, highlight that date, November 11th, 1918. World War I came to an end. Keep highlighting today, November 11th is celebrated as Veterans Day, honoring those who have fought for our country in any war and those who have served in the nation's armed forces. So it celebrates all veterans who have fought and those who have died. So the treaty was signed on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So it was 11 o'clock on November 11th. And that was known as Armistice Day until after World War II. So that is World War I. Let's look at section 12.4, Between the World Wars. No more highlights on page 222. Look over to page 223. We have a whole new era here. The country became very prosperous after World War I. Production increased. They were starting to get things like more electricity in houses. Radios were a big thing. People could now listen to news and listen to stories and programs on the radio. They started to get things like electric washing machines, electric refrigerators, all things that radically changed life in America. So let's check out our president during part of this time on page 223, Calvin Coolidge. And he was known as a man who had just really a lot of good common sense. So find the italicized words in that box. The strength of the nation depended upon the character of the people, and highlight those words and know that Calvin Coolidge believed this. The strength of a nation depends on the character of the people. A nation can have a huge military, a nation can be very wealthy, but if her people do not have good, strong character and decency to them, then she is not going to be a strong nation. President Coolidge was kind of an interesting guy. He was very quiet. He didn't like to talk a lot. So one of his nicknames was Silent Cal. A story goes that he was at a dinner party one time, and there was a young woman sitting next to him, and she told him that she had a bet with a friend that she could get him to say more than 2 words to her in a conversation. And she told him this as she was sitting next to him at dinner. And he turned, he looked at her, and he said exactly 2 words. And those 2 words were, "You lose." And he refused to say anything else. So kind of a funny story there about President Coolidge. And he was an interesting guy, but very high character, very well liked, and a good president. Let's turn the page to 224 and see challenges to Christianity. Highlight this guy's name, Charles Darwin, and highlight that he was a British naturalist, not scientist, a naturalist. That's just somebody who studies nature. He was not trained, he was not taught as a scientist. Very big difference there. So highlight a British naturalist who rejected the scriptures and said that man had evolved from animals. Follow down with the paragraph there, find the underlined words underneath the numbering there. And highlight many of the people who affirmed the truth of the Bible were called fundamentalists. On the next column, find where it says the Scopes trial or the monkey trial. Highlight that, the Scopes trial or the monkey trial. And this was a trial to determine whether or not evolution would be taught in public schools. Of course, it is today, but back then, this was a big fight. And highlight the underlined portion there, William Jennings Bryan won the case against evolution. So he won this particular trial, and that's going to be important to know. Highlight this guy's name, Dr. Harry Rimmer. Know him. Highlight that he wrote several books that effectively refuted the theory of evolution. A little bit further down, highlight J. Gresham Machen, and highlight that he gave radio talks about the truth of the Bible and the falseness of modernism. So very influential guys there in the 1920s. Now let's look across the page to page 225, and let's look at the Great Depression. Highlight the underlined portion there. These difficult years from 1929 to 1939 became known as the Great Depression. So you want to know the name, and you want to know those dates that it ran to. So October 1929, banks ran out of money, the stock market crashed, factories started closing down, people lost their jobs, and you can see the pictures there. We have a picture of the men who had lost their jobs waiting in soup lines, and that was a very common thing there during the Depression. So they could go and they could get a very cheap meal at those soup lines. A lot of them were even completely free. And then the other picture, we have a guy trying to sell his car. So notice what his sign says there. $100 will buy this car. Must have cash. Lost all on the stock market. That's what people were doing. They were buying up a lot of stock. They were buying things at, they were paying more than what things were actually worth. So once everything crashed, they lost all of their money and they had no way of getting it back. On the next column, find President D. Roosevelt. His name is in bold there. Highlight that Franklin D. Roosevelt thought of a way to create jobs through projects like building highways, dams, and bridges. So it was a big project. It was a good idea in a way because it provided jobs for people who needed them, but the problem was that the government was paying them. And the government was just as poor as everyone else. When people are out of work and they're not having jobs to pay their taxes, then the government loses money too. So highlight this, the government began to spend more money than it had. It began to spend more money than it had. And what happens when you spend more money than you actually have? You go into debt. And the trend started here during the Great Depression with President Roosevelt, the government spending more money than they had. And now today, the U.S. government is trillions of dollars in debt. And most of us can't even imagine $1 trillion, but that is it's a lot of money. So that is it for our highlights for this section. Make sure that you complete all of your reading, answer all of your questions, and don't forget to be reading through the Gettysburg Address every single day. And at some point, since we won't be back in school for a while, we'll talk about making videos of you guys saying that. So I will talk to you more about that, and you guys have a great day.